we're going to start a new series called Kingdom Living. And the series is actually for today and for next week is going to be a two-part of one lesson, which that lesson's called The Blessed Life. And we're going to be looking at the Beatitudes. It might actually be a three-part series. I told Samantha as I was typing it up, I'm like, man, this particular portion of this lesson is a lot longer than what I thought about it in my mind once I started digging into it. Which I guess anything with the Bible can be like that. And I said I can either divide it into parts, or I can be like one of my buddies who's a pastor out in Miami and just have like a 2.5-hour service. And it's crazy watching them, thinking about it, because like we would go to Jamaica and we'd have a service that lasted from basically 7 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. And people wouldn't. The first time I experienced, I remember I asked Bishop Evans, I said, Bishop, why is it that you guys can have services like this down here and we don't? He goes, well, it's a matter of distractions. I said, what do you mean? He goes, in America, you have everything to distract you. You have church on Sunday, and you have to be home by 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon to be able to catch the football games, and you have church in the evening that you're late for because there's a night game that's going on, and you don't have church on Monday because you have Monday night football. You don't have church on Saturdays because that's college football. Friday night is high school football. I'm like, all right, I'm starting to get the point here. But as I was doing this particular lesson, I said either I can have a Jamaican or a Keith Moore service, or I could just split it into a couple of different things. So it's going to be about 2, maybe 3 different parts that I'm able to teach on the Beatitudes, but the Kingdom Living will be a longer series, so these will just be subcomponents of this series. But we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 5 as we do this, and we'll be going over the Beatitudes to start with on Kingdom Living, because Jesus, actually, his Sermon on the Mount was on Kingdom Living, and he opened up a lot of what he spoke about in the Sermon on the Mount when he went through the Beatitudes on things that we should be doing, things that we should be looking at, and the way that God changes us so that we can focus on the other things that need to be changed in our life also for kingdom living on this earth. But before I get into it, I just wanted to ask you a couple of things and kind of look at something. Have you ever looked at a sunset? And, you know, there's some sunsets that are more beautiful than others, right? And then there's just those sunsets that you're like, that has got to be the most beautiful sunset God has ever made. And have you ever wondered about those? Wondered why they're like that? Why some are just plain and some are more beautiful, some are less plain? Have you ever thought about that? Why is one sunset so much prettier than another? Because I look at it from this aspect. I've been all over the world, and everywhere that I've been on the world, I've seen some sunsets that it's just an orange sun that's going down and that's it. And then I've seen other sunsets everywhere that I've been that are just the most beautiful thing, just a painting that's out there in the sky. And I'm sure everybody sees that. You know, we look at Facebook at times and somebody will post a picture of the sunset and they say, this is why I love living where I live. But in all actuality, those type of sunsets exist everywhere. But have you ever thought about what makes them? Yeah, sure, God does, but what makes a sunset so beautiful? You ever thought about that? So I thought about it one time, so I looked it up. And it was an interesting answer that I got. You know, you think about the kids that ask, well, Dad, why is the sky blue? Well, you know, there's certain particles of water that are in the sky that make it look this color and so on and so forth. And there's a scientific definition. There's a scientific definition also for sunsets. Basically, as the sun's going down over the horizon, I guess it's really staying in the same spot, and as the world turns and it makes it look like the sun is going down, and we look at it, the sunlight has to pass through more atmosphere. So scientists say that as it passes through more atmosphere, the color of it changes, because if you look at the sun when it's at its peak point, it looks white or yellow. I wouldn't suggest doing it too often because then you're going to lose your sight, but it'll look a white color or a yellowish color. But as it goes down, it becomes orange or maybe even red. And we look at these things, and it's because it passes through more atmosphere. And that's what scientists will tell you. But as I continued studying it, it's more then it's just passing through more atmosphere, because it passes through atmosphere as it's up here. And sometimes as it's up here, you can look up and it'll be a reddish color. And I wish I was hooked up to this, because I could show you a picture in which there was a lunar eclipse and the sun looked red in the middle of the day. I could show you a picture of myself and some of my soldiers out in the middle of Iraq, one behind the other, and you look up and the sun looked a very dingy red because of the sandstorm that was going on at the time.
Oh, wow.
And that's actually what causes the sun to look different colors in the sunsets and even at sunrise. You hear red in the morning, sailor take warning, red at night, sailor's delight. So the sun can change colors, but it doesn't really change colors. What happens is, as it's passing through atmosphere, there are certain molecules that exist that bend the light of the sun and make it look a different color. But that's the scientific way of saying it. The reality of it is there's impurities, there's pollution that exists in the air, that as the sun is lower to the ground or lower to the horizon, it has to bend around the pollution and it changes the color. And isn't it amazing how God can take something like pollution that's so nasty and so ugly and make something beautiful from it? You ever thought about that? How does God take something that is so bad and create beauty from it? So as I was thinking about it this morning, I thought that's the perfect thing to talk about when we look at the Beatitudes. How can God change something into something so beautiful? Or how can we see God's work in action through all the nastiness and ugliness that exists in this world? So I want to read today in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And it's going to be the first part of a series, of a sub-series that goes to the series of Kingdom Living. So I want you to think this. Is there anything that God cannot change to become beautiful? Okay? So Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on the mountain, he being Jesus, and he was seated with his disciples. When he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. So at this point, he's leading into the Sermon on the Mount, but the only people that are really close enough to hear him are his own disciples. And a lot of people will teach that the Beatitudes was part of the Sermon on the Mount. It was actually the precursor to the Sermon on the Mount. So he began saying to them, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they rival and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Amen. So that takes us through verse 12 there. And I'll be looking at different portions of the blessed during the first three parts of Kingdom Living, and then I'll be looking at other things during some later parts. But it's all based on being blessed. It all is based off of the Beatitudes that leads us to other things. So have you ever wondered why it's called the Beatitudes? Do you even know what Beatitudes means? Most people don't. And for the longest time, I didn't know. I'm like, Beatitudes. Oh, Beatitudes. It sounds like attitude. So it's probably something to deal with attitude. Man, was I wrong. I was completely wrong. When I actually looked it up, I realized that the word beatitude comes from the Latin word beatitudo, which means blessedness. So the Beatitudes is the blessedness of God. And Jesus is telling about these things. And he would use these things as the gateway that God brings his change into one's life. He spoke about those things of the change that God brings in the Sermon on the Mount. So he first let the disciples in on the Beatitudes so that they would have a better view when he started preaching the Sermon on the Mount to the mass of people that was there, so that they would have a better understanding of what God does for us, of the change that God brings in our life. So the Beatitudes are listed only in 2 of the Gospels, Matthew chapter 5 and Luke chapter 6. And for the most part, they're the same. But there's a little difference, which we'll get to in a little bit. So what does it mean to be blessed? My first point is, what is blessed? And I want you to think about this. Have you ever had somebody tell you, well, you're blessed because, and then you can fill in the blank from there. Maybe you hear them tell somebody, well, you're so blessed because you can sing so beautiful. Or you're so blessed because you have such well-behaved children. You're so blessed because you have money. You have all the money that you'll ever need. You're blessed because you never let anything get to you. You're blessed because you're always happy. And so as you hear these things, you hear them say things like always or never or the most or whatever you'll need. And you'll also hear them say that you're blessed because of things that exist in your life, things that you have. Have you ever noticed that? Mm-hmm. Have you ever wondered is that really what makes me blessed? Because as I look at this, Jesus didn't say that. Jesus actually said in the Beatitudes quite the opposite. People weren't blessed because of things that they had. He said the opposite. In ancient times, to say that somebody was blessed was to say that they were in a state of well-being. But when Jesus said it, it was more than that. Today, it's because of a state of ownership of something that somebody is blessed. And when Jesus says it, it's something completely different from that. When he said it, Jesus implied that the person was divinely at a place of peace, regardless of what the circumstances in their life were. Isn't that pretty crazy? Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of worry, which doesn't sound like it should belong if there's peace. But it wasn't a peace as in everything was perfect. It was a peace that there was an existence and a relationship that existed with God, that nothing that was happening, nothing that was going on, nothing that was lacking in a person's life could change that. It's kind of interesting to think of it like that, right? You are blessed because you know God. That might be a better way of saying it, right? It doesn't matter if you have money. It doesn't matter if you have relationships with people. It doesn't matter if your dog loves you or not. What mattered is the relationship that you have with God. That's it. The circumstances can't change that. He was saying that the person possessed an inward set of qualities that produced the beauty of God in one's life, even when things didn't appear so. You know, you think today about some of the theologies that are out there. Theologies that teach that God is doing amazing things in people's lives because they're being blessed financially. Or that God is doing amazing things in people's life because their health is perfect. But the reality of it was this, that God can do things in people's life when there's not financial wealth that exists. And God can do amazing things in people's life when there's not health that exists, or when the situation of one's life isn't perfect. But most people, much like in the book of Job, well, Job suffered according to his friends because he wasn't right with God. But what they didn't understand was that the reason that Job truly suffered was because he was right with God, and God said, hey, have you considered my servant Job? When the devil came and said, is there any that is perfect and righteous or upright that exist? Look at Job. Well, he wouldn't be like that if. Well, he is like that, so go ahead and test him. Have you ever thought about that? When you're going through the trials of your life, it's so easy to say, well, where's God during the trial of this part of my life? Where's God at? Where's God when he sees that person over there suffering? Where's God when that person struggles financially or when something is not going right? Where is God? It's easy to ask that. But when we look at Job, oftentimes one who knows God will be going through those things because they're considered by God to be in the right state, to be blessed. So there's a testing that is allowed. And it's not a testing for God to see if you're like that. He already knows that you're like that. It's a testing to show, one, you, that God is really there, and regardless of the circumstances, does great things in our life. And two, that the devil can't beat us. He can try everything that he wants to, but he can't beat us. So as we look at these things, we realize that Jesus is actually saying the opposite of what most people say blessed is. We have a relationship that would produce a beautiful sunset at the end of the day, even though there are bad things that are causing some type of displacement. The light will bend around it. So what do the Beatitudes tell us? And this is really where the sermon was going to get long, so I told Samantha I better split this one. I want to try and keep people's attention. So we'll start from the beginning. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You know, the interesting thing about it is this is the one difference that I was talking about. Because when you look at Luke, he says, blessed are the poor. And a lot of times people will talk about that and they'll say, well, you know, those that don't have very much here on this earth, blessed are they because God provides for them. But it's more than that, because Matthew does the full thought. He doesn't leave it open for interpretation. He gives the full thought. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And all of these, the first question that comes out of our mind is, what does that even mean? What does that mean? Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And it's speaking of those that no matter how much better we as people think that we have become in this life, that they still understand that we are deprived, that we are in poverty when it comes to the Spirit of God on this earth. We don't have it as much as what we think that we have it. Is he there? Is it something that makes us better? Absolutely. But we still live in poverty because it's not as much as what we will have one day. That day when we're able to be with him physically in heaven, we're going to be wealthy in that day. You see, it doesn't make us, when we realize this, it's not that it's making us any better by what we do, but we're better because of what Jesus Christ does in our life. So a way of putting it is that we would be spiritually bankrupt if Jesus wasn't part of our life. Bankrupt. Nothing in the account. Can't pay the bills. Can't get the food. Don't have housing. Just out there wandering with nothing. And that's the way that we would be without Jesus in our life. It's nothing that I do. It's all that he does. Because even coming to know God is through the Spirit's calling to us, through the Spirit's guidance. The next one, blessed are those who mourn. What do they mourn for? What is mourning? A lot of people will tell you that mourning is that you desire that something were to exist. If you had a loved one that had passed away and you mourn, you desire their presence. You desire to have their presence back. That's not completely untrue, but it's not completely true either. Because mourning doesn't mean simply to desire something, but mourning actually means to have sorrow or regret. So therefore, when someone passes away, a loved one, you have sorrow that they are no longer with you. Perhaps you have regrets that the last moment that you spent with them wasn't the best moment. I've seen that here recently, in which someone had passed away and there was regret that existed. That's mourning. When one mourns in this manner, it's showing the sorrow that they have for the sin that has existed in their life. Perhaps even the regret that they have had for certain things that they have done in their life that they now know, because of Jesus' leading, was sinful. One who mourns in this manner realizes the impact that sin had not only in their life, but in everybody else's life that has come in contact with them when they were in that state. And let's be honest, just because we walk with Jesus doesn't mean that sin no longer exists. It just doesn't have the impact on us that it once had. Maybe we still do get tripped up every now and again, but we know where to turn when that happens. There are many today who have never showed sorrow for the sin that they've committed. And a lot of that comes from the theology that exists in churches today also. They simply say, I accept that I have sinned, and I know that God forgives me because of it, so it's time to move on. But one who truly mourns because of the sin that has existed in their life shows sorrow and shows regret that it existed in their life, because they understand the impact that it had not only on them but also on those that they had come in contact with. They understand the damage that it has done, the scarring that is created, the wounding that it has done that created those scars in a person's spiritual life. Because even though the wound may heal, the scar will always be there. The scar will always exist. Think of an injury. I think of an injury that's on my hand. I remember I was walking down the railroad tracks one day, and as I was walking down the railroad tracks, I heard somebody from behind me that called my name, so I turned and I looked, but I kept on walking, not paying attention where I was stepping. And the cross ties, they stood up a little bit higher than what they used to, because the rocks had been washed away from all the different storms that had come and all, and I tripped over a cross tie. And as I fell and I went to catch myself, my hand slid down the railroad track where it had been chipped, and it was sharp, and it cut my finger. And to this day, I still have a scar on my finger. And there was damage that was done, and there could have been more damage that was done too. But the damage that was done created an issue in which everything all the way down to the bone was ripped out of my finger. And I once, believe it or not, you can ask my wife, she probably won't believe it, but I once used to actually write pretty nice. But when I did this, it damaged the muscle in my hand, in my finger that I would use for writing. And I never really tried to learn how to write nice again. I just kind of, that's good enough. Because for about 2 or 3 months, my hand was in recovery. I had stitches in it, and I had to go and see the doctor, and they had to make sure that it was healing properly and all like that. But I also said that there could have been more damage that was done. I remember, and actually there was some more damage that was done too, just not to me. So that can be compared to sin also. Sometimes there's damage that's done to us through sin, but there's also damage done to others. Because I can remember my mother, my grandmother took me to my mother's house and asked her if she could fix it. My mother said, no, he's going to have to go to the emergency room. And I remember my mother taking care of me as long as she had to. But once somebody else took it, she couldn't handle it anymore. She walked out of the room. She passed out. She hits a surgical table. That afternoon, I'm walking out of the emergency room, and she's in the hospital because of a concussion. Isn't that like sin, though? Sin can damage us, but sometimes it can damage somebody else even worse. And it's humorous to think about it. But the more damage that could have come to me was, as I was sitting there, I remember seeing the ER doctor who thought that he could stitch the entire thing closed on one side, arguing with the surgeon on the other side, who said, if you stitched it closed, there's nothing there to stitch closed. If you stitched it closed, it's going to rip open the other side of his finger because there's nothing there. So I remember they put 2 stitches in the bottom where there was something and 2 stitches in the top, and the rest remained an open wound. And it had to heal and build scar tissue. So it took it a while to be able to do that. So as you look at my finger now today, from here to here is a scar that exists about 1/4 inch wide. And that's all it is, all the way to the bone, is scar tissue. So anything that moves my finger doesn't come from that side of the finger, it comes from the other side of the finger. Which, if the ER doctor would have done what he would have, it would have damaged the other side. And then who knows if I would have had movement in my finger or not. But a person who regrets and understands that damage that's caused, or mourns, not necessarily regrets, but has sorrow of the damage that was caused, regrets things that are unable to be taken back, they understand the power of God's forgiveness in our life. They understand that the things that existed sometimes existed just because we are men, because we are people, and we are born into sin. And they understand also that sometimes the things that happened, the sin that happened that damaged themselves or somebody else, was simply because of the things that they did. I once was told by a very wise man in the army, sometimes bad things happen to good people. And there's a reason for it. And sometimes that reason is because those good people are stupid. I was like, huh. And of course he told me this right after I had messed something up. And you know, I kind of think about that because I think maybe he was referring to me as being stupid in that moment. And maybe he was right. But those that understand sorrow, those are the ones that understand it's about more than saying, God, I'm sorry. That's the beginning of it. Don't get me wrong. That is the beginning of it. Telling God that you are sorry for the sin that has existed in your life, for the sin that you have done in your life. But it's more than that, because even as we look at what reconciliation is, we understand that it's more than just saying that I am sorry. But it's about trying to go back to the original state of how they were. Okay, so that's not the original state just of where I came from. That's the original state of the relationship that man had with God in the beginning. It was a perfect and sinless relationship. Total trust in God. And those who show sorrow, those who understand the reality of God's forgiveness, understand that it's more than just saying, I'm sorry. But it's also the turning away from that sin. Because you see, there's so many people out there that'll teach, well, it's okay that you sin because you have already gotten forgiveness for the sin that you're going to do tomorrow. That's not what the Bible teaches, though. It's not at all what the Bible teaches. What the Bible teaches is that you ask for forgiveness of the sins that you have committed, and you turn your life around to where you do your greatest, and you rely on Jesus to be able to live a life like what he did. It's not, oh, I already know that I'm going to mess up, and that's okay. Do I know that I'm going to mess up? Absolutely. But it's not just okay because I know it, and I'm asking God for forgiveness before I ever do it. It's okay because I understand the power of God's forgiveness. Because I understand that in having sorrow, in having regret of sin, that I'm going to desire to do the things of Jesus Christ. And I may mess up every now and again, but I'm still going to desire overall to be doing the things of Jesus Christ and following in him. You see, we understand that as in most cases of mourning that exist with people, there exists death. You know that? Somewhere where there's mourning, there's likely that there's death that existed. And where there's mourning in our spiritual life, there is death that has to exist. Because without Jesus Christ, there is death. Death comes to one without Jesus Christ. But the one who mourns that death has come, there comes life through Jesus Christ also. So now it makes a little bit more sense of how Paul, or why Paul said, I die daily. It's because he mourned after Jesus. There was a death that existed in his life and continually existed so that he would follow after Jesus Christ instead of his own fleshly desires. And I'm sure that, yes, even Paul the Apostle, had his times in where he messed up. One of those times would have been what caused him and Barnabas to split up. It's because he got so angry with Mark. Him and Barnabas went separate ways. And later in life, you see that there was reconciliation that exists as he asked for Mark to come to him. So see, it's not about living in a manner that I can do whatever I want to do and God's going to forgive me. It's about living in a manner that I understand that I have messed up, that I'm going to mess up again at some point in time, but I seek God's forgiveness. I don't expect it. I seek it. Blessed are the meek. So what does meek mean? Does it mean weak? Actually, no, it means the quite opposite of being weak. Weakness is due to negative circumstances that exist in our life. Lack of ability, lack of strength, lack of knowledge are three main ones. Meekness is due to positive circumstances in our life. Having the ability, having the strength, and having the knowledge. See, meekness and weakness are actually quite the opposite. Weakness does because they don't understand, so they follow others who have the same lack of understanding. That's weakness. Following somebody who doesn't understand, that's weakness. Meekness does not do it because they understand the negative impact that can come from following somebody else who doesn't understand. What did they not understand? The will of God. Weakness does something only to become injured because of a lack of strength or knowledge. Meekness does not do it because they have the strength to refrain from doing something and the knowledge to understand what limitations they have or are set before them by the Spirit of God. Weakness is arrogant. Have you ever seen that before? Somebody who doesn't have a mental capacity, somebody who thinks that they're tougher. I think of the cartoon. You know, there's a cartoon that exists. It used to come on with Warner Brothers, and it was Sylvester the cat. And there were two dogs. There's the little dog that was always yapping and barking and everything else, and then there was the big bulldog that was all muscular and everything. That little dog was very arrogant, thinking that he had accomplished the things that happened to that cat, when it was actually the bigger dog that was doing it for him. There was an arrogance that existed in that little dog's weakness. And I think of a time when I was younger that there was a little bit of arrogance that existed in my life. It wasn't really a little bit. It was quite big. Because I thought that I was better at some things. I thought that I was stronger than what I was in some ways. But meekness isn't arrogant. Meekness is humble. Weakness rebels against the things of God, while meekness understands the need for God. It's quite the opposite of each other, right? But they seem very similar when you look at it. You see a guy sitting quiet as somebody belittles him. Perhaps it's not weakness that keeps him from saying something. Perhaps it's meekness. I remember a time in my life when I had gone home and a friend of mine asked me, because we'd gone out together and somebody had gotten up in my face and everything, and he asked me, he goes, Rob, he goes, man, back in high school you would have been fighting if somebody had done that to you. Why don't you now? And I told him, I was like, you know, And he asked me, he goes, is it because of the military? I was like, no, actually, the military gave me a pretty good temper on top of the one that I already had. I was like, but what really helped me was some years ago, I started studying jiu-jitsu with my brother. And I realized in studying jiu-jitsu that most people don't know what they're doing when they fight. And I learned how to fight. So I kind of already know what the outcome is going to be with somebody who doesn't know how to fight when I already know how to fight. It's like, plus, I go to the gym and I get beat up 7 days a week. Why do I want to fight anymore after that? And he just kind of looked at me and goes, huh, well, that's different than the Rob I knew growing up. Yeah, I'm sure it's quite a bit different. But meekness can sometimes be understood as a person being weak when they remain quiet, as a person being weak or without knowledge because they don't respond or react to something, and people say, well, you know, they must be weak, when in all actuality they're showing strength, because the person who's weak is more than likely the guy on the other side or the gal on the other side. And that's how it is with us. Those who rely on God realize what the limitations are. They realize what our actual weaknesses are. So they realize that there is a need to rely on God, to follow God, and to do the things of God. Whereas those who do not rely on God because they say, well, I don't need God in my life. I can do whatever I want to without God. I can accomplish the things that I want without God. That's the true weakness, is realizing or not realizing the need that everybody has for God. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And this will be the last one that I'm covering today. But blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Notice it doesn't just say blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Because people can hunger and thirst after anything. But to live after righteousness is to live after being justified by God according to God's morals. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. The Bible says that Noah was righteous because he walked with God. In other words, Noah lived by the morals that God set before him. I remember telling a friend last night, because it was already on my mind, hunger is a great motivator. You get hungry and you're going to do some pretty amazing things. If one is hungry, and I mean truly hungry, not just a little grumbling in the stomach, but they're truly hungry. They haven't eaten for a few days or a week. Hunger is going to set in. And if they have no way of getting something to fill that hunger, they're going to figure something out. I was once told that someone who is homeless and starving, someone who is truly hungry, not just a beggar on the street, will find a way to eat. And they continued to tell me the beggar on the street will sit there and ask for money until he has enough money to go and buy whatever it is that he wants, a cheeseburger at McDonald's, maybe a steak at the local steakhouse, or whatever it is. They'll sit there and they'll beg and beg and beg. But a person who is homeless and truly hungry, that's the guy that you see that when they haven't gotten money in order to pay for some food, you'll see them digging through the trash can looking for the food that's left over in there. And they'll eat it because they understand that, yeah, it may smell bad, but it still has some nutritional value to it. Are we truly hungry for God? Or are we just some beggar who stands by and gets the little bit that we need to go off and eat somewhere? Interesting also that he puts hunger with thirst here, because I was once reading and I read that a person oftentimes will think that they're hungry when they're actually thirsty. Because until the point of starvation or until the point of being dehydrated, the body can't tell the difference between the two. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Excuse me. So a person sometimes will think that they're hungry when they're thirsty, and they can't distinguish the two. Excuse me. So when we get to the point that we truly understand that there's no way without Jesus, and that means that only eating of him, only drinking of his cup, then at that point We will come to the point that we will accept what he sets before us. We will truly desire him and everything of him. We will do whatever it takes to have him. We will stop being picky with our eating habits. I think of two of my kids. I won't say who they are because they know who they are and they're sitting right here. But two of my kids that will set food before them. And the other kids will eat it very easily, as will myself and my wife. And they'll look at it, and even though they ate it the time before, they're so picky that they'll be like, I don't like that. I'm not eating that. Do you have something else? Are there chicken nuggets in the refrigerator? Is there a cheeseburger? Maybe some bacon or something like that. Everybody loves bacon, right? And sometimes that's how we are with God too. We become so picky in the things that he sets before us that we say, I don't want to do that. I don't like doing that. I'm going to go do something else that people will recognize as me doing something for Jesus. But as I think about it, I think about this. Those who are hungry and thirsty versus those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness. I think of people who say that they're hungry, and maybe I might be talking about some of my kids on this one too. They want to go eat a Twinkie instead of having something good to eat. You know, you set before them some broccoli or some celery or something like that that's healthy for them. And well, I don't want to eat that. Well, then you're not hungry. Well, I want a Twinkie though. Well, that's not necessarily hungry. But those who say that they're hungry and thirsty will sit there and eat those things that are not sustainable to the body. Those who are hungry and thirsty, maybe they'll have some candy here and they'll have another snack over here, but it's not really something that's going to sustain the body. So you start seeing the body will wither away, or maybe the opposite. You'll start seeing them put on a lot of weight because they're eating the things that aren't healthy for the body. So the body starts pushing it away, and either they wither away or they put on a lot of weight, and they become weaker. Well, they're eating all the time. I don't understand why they don't have any strength. Because they're not eating what the body needs. Well, they drink all the time. I think of a story here recently of a young lady who decided that she was no longer going to drink water. All she was going to drink was soda pop. And she began to dehydrate because all she was drinking was soda pop. And I think it says that after a week, she had dehydrated herself to the point that by the time the medical personnel made it there, it was beyond recovery, and she ended up dying. Because she didn't want to drink water. She didn't want to drink the things that would sustain her, the things that would help her body out. She wanted the things that tasted good and all like that. There are things that exist in this world that you can hunger after, things that people want you to do, that it's okay because everybody else is doing it. And it's just fine because they seem to be doing just fine. But the ultimate thing is it's not something that's going to be able to sustain their spirit. So instead, what's happening is that their spiritual body is dwindling away. Their spiritual body is struggling. They're losing the strength that they need to be able to make it. And eventually, death will come for them too. Yeah. But it's a death that's far worse than anything that we could think of in this world. Because it's an eternal death from God himself. An eternal separation because it was okay because everybody else did it. Have you ever thought that? It's okay that people do this because in the movies, it's in all the movies now. So everybody must be doing it. It's okay that I partake in this because all my friends are doing this also. Every single one of my friends are doing this. And typically when somebody's speaking about what needs to be done right, we kind of turn the other way so we don't have to listen to it. It's time to not be so picky. Those things that God puts before us, it's time for us to eat those things. You see, we're deprived spiritually. We have deprived our spirit, and which everybody has done according to the book of Romans, because the book of Romans says everybody has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody has been deprived at some point in time. But those that are no longer deprived are the ones that have turned to Jesus for his salvation. You You see, we have to understand that through this, we're provided the things that we need to eat. We're provided the things that we need to drink spiritually, so that our body will be able to sustain, so that we will have a long, eternal life beyond this life, something that's greater than we could ever expect, greater than anything that we could ever imagine. All we have to do is hunger and thirst after his righteousness, and then when he puts those things in front of us, those are the things that we take. If he puts spiritual vegetables in front of us that we don't normally eat, go ahead and eat them. Maybe even if it's spiritual liver. Nasty stuff. So as I opened up today, as I close now, I spoke about impurities that made the sunsets beautiful. And I think about the impurities in our life. And it's not that God uses those impurities to make our life good. What actually happens is you see, it's not the impurities that are part of the sun. It's the impurities that exist in the world that show how the light will bend and turn and go around all these different molecules, and it will become beautiful as it does that. It's the same with the impurities in our life. The impurities in our life aren't what's the beautiful thing. The impurities in our life enhance that which is beautiful, which is the light of Jesus Christ, because that light will bend and turn around every single impurity in our life so that it sheds life on us. And from that, we're able to see even more the beauty of God's salvation, the beauty of the light of Jesus Christ in our life. It's not that we need to keep the impurities, it's that we're able to see what is beautiful in light of the impurities. I think about this as I continue to close, that Jesus spoke about this a couple of times. He spoke about those who have been forgiven much will love much. He spoke about that when the lady came and washed his feet and poured out the oil from the alabaster box on him. Those who are forgiven much love much. There's also the I just went blank on what I was going to say. Paul speaking, where Paul says, where sin increases, grace abounds more. In other words, the more that sin existed, a person would be able to understand and accept grace more, because they knew how important grace was. And he said, does that mean that we need to sin more? Of course not. It means that the sin that exists in our life should show us the beauty of God. It should show us Jesus. It should show us the grace that was given to us. It doesn't mean that we have to go out there and partake in sin. Just that we see the way that the light has bended around the sin that exists in our lives, that points us to the beauty of the salvation that Jesus Christ himself brought to us. Amen?